In 1882, in the New Mexico Territory, the sun was a hammer over the Dry Arrow Ranch. It beat down on the warped silver planks of the porch, on the baked earth of the yard, and on the broad, still shoulders of Cole Maddox. He stood with his hands resting on the peeled log railing, his gaze fixed on the distant, hazy line where the ochre plains met the bruised purple of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. It was a gaze that gave nothing away and asked for nothing in return. It was the color of river stones in a dry wash, flat and hard and cold. For 5 years, that gaze had not softened. For 5 years, the muscles around his mouth had not moved to form a smile, not a real one. He was a tall man, built with the stark, functional strength of the fence posts he drove into the unforgiving ground. His hair was the color of dust, his face a landscape of planes and angles carved by sun and wind, and a grief so profound it had become a part of his bones. The silence at the Dry Arrow was a living thing. It was in the buzz of a lone fly against a dusty window pane, in the tired creak of the windmill turning, in the vast, empty sky that swallowed all other sounds. It was a silence Cole had cultivated, a wall he had built around the hollow space inside him. Down in the town of Arroyo Mesa, a place Cole visited only when necessity demanded. The silence was filled with whispers. The whispers followed him like his own shadow whenever he rode in for supplies. They slithered from behind the calico curtains of the mercantile, coiled in the shade of the assay office, and dissipated into the dust kicked up by his horse. The story was always the same, worn smooth with retelling. They said Cole Maddox had buried his wife, Sarah, and their boy, Thomas, on a wind-whipped hill behind his ranch house. They said he'd done it with his own 2 hands after the barn fire. They never spoke of the flames, not in detail, but Cole saw them. He saw them in the heart of the blacksmith's forge, in the flicker of his own lonely lantern at night, in the fiery spectacle of every sunset. He could still smell the smoke, a phantom scent of burned hay, scorched pine, and something else, something he would spend the rest of his life trying to forget. The whispers said the fire had taken everything from him. They were wrong. It had left him with the memories, and that was infinitely worse than nothing. Today, necessity demanded. The salt was low. The last of the .44 cartridges sat in his gun belt, and a roll of new barbed wire was needed to mend the southern fence line before the autumn muster. He saddled his buckskin, a stoic, silent beast much like its owner, and rode toward the collection of adobe and wood buildings that huddled in the heat. Arroyo Mesa shimmered, a dusty jewel in the vast emptiness. As he approached, the overland stagecoach station was the first building to take clear form. It was little more than a long, low structure of sun-baked brick, its porch roof sagging under the weight of the relentless sun. A fine red dust coated everything, a permanent blush on the face of the territory. A small crowd had gathered. That in itself was an event. Cole drew his horse to a halt near the water trough, his eyes narrowing. The Butterfield stage was late, which meant it was arriving. He had intended to go straight to Henderson's mercantile, to get his business done and be gone before the weight of the town's pitying. Fearful eyes became too much to bear, but the stage held a certain gravity, a promise of a new face, a new story to whisper about. For a few minutes, at least, they might forget about the man made of stone, the coach, caked in the dust of 1,000 miles, grown to a stop in a cloud of its own making. The driver, a leather-faced man named Silas, wrapped the reins and spat a stream of tobacco juice that sizzled on the ground. The door swung open. First, a dusty black boot emerged, then a hand, gloved in worn leather, gripping the doorframe, and then she stepped down into the full glare of the New Mexico sun. She was not beautiful in the way of the saloon girls in Santa Fe, all paint and lace. Her beauty was of a different order, like the quiet resilience of a desert flower. Her hair, the color of sun-bleached cedar, was pinned up but had come loose in places, soft tendrils framing a face that was determined and intelligent. She wore a practical traveling dress of dark gray poplin, dusty but well-made. One hand went to the brim of her simple hat, holding it against a sudden gust of wind. while the other clutched the handle of a curious wooden box, its brass lens catching the light. This was Eva Mercer. She took a deep breath, her gray eyes scanning the small assembly of faces with a frank and open curiosity. There was no coyness in her look, no plea for acceptance. She was simply seeing what was there. Cole watched from the back, a silent observer. He saw the shift in the crowd. He saw the way the men ranch hands. A prospector. The town blacksmith straightened up, their expressions a mixture of surprise and a primal, hopeful interest. He saw the women Mrs. Henderson from the mercantile. The pastor's wife exchanged quick, assessing glances. It was the familiar, unspoken welcome of a small town, a blend of suspicion and a desperate hunger for novelty. Eva seemed oblivious, or perhaps simply indifferent, to their scrutiny. Her attention was focused. She saw the postmaster, Mr. Gable, emerging from his office next to the station. Mr. Gable. Her voice was clear, with a crispness that cut through the thick afternoon air. It was a voice that expected an answer. "That's me, ma'am. Eva Mercer. I was told a crate of photographic plates would be arriving for me from Santa Fe. Did they make it on this coach?" She was a photographer. The wooden box was a camera. The word rippled through the onlookers. A woman photographer. It was an oddity, another piece of the puzzle they were all silently trying to assemble. A telegrapher. 2. The letter she'd sent ahead had said, "A woman of strange and modern trades." Cole's list of supplies repeated in his head salt. Cartridges, wire. It was a litany to keep him grounded, to remind him of his purpose here. He had no interest in new arrivals, in telegraphers or photographers. They were complications, temporary distractions from the enduring realities of land and loss. He nudged his horse forward, preparing to move on. And then, her eyes met his. It was not a deliberate seeking out. Her gaze was simply sweeping over the faces before her, the polite scan of a stranger in a new place, for a brief, suspended moment. The world narrowed to the 20 yards of dusty ground between them. He saw the clarity of her eyes, the color of a sky before a storm. He saw the intelligence there, the weariness of her journey, and something else in absence of judgment. She looked at him not as the town's tragic figure, not as the silent man with ghosts in his eyes, but simply as another person standing in the sun. And she smiled. It was not a large smile. It was a small, quiet lift at the corners of her mouth, a simple, reflexive gesture of civility offered to a stranger. It was uncomplicated. It asked for nothing. It was like offering a cup of cool water on a hot day. For 5 years, women had tried to smile at Cole Maddox. There were the hopeful smiles of widows, the pitying smiles of married women, the nervous smiles of young girls. He had met them all with the same stony indifference. He had built a fortress around himself, and their smiles were like arrows bouncing harmlessly off granite walls. But this one was different. It didn't try to get in. It simply existed, a small, bright thing in the dusty air. And for a reason he could not fathom, it found a crack. A muscle jumped in his jaw. The line of his mouth, which had forgotten how to curve upward, tightened into a hard, straight line. He gave her a nod so brief it was almost an insult, a sharp, downward jerk of his chin. Then he pulled on the reins, turning his horse's head away with more force than was necessary. He stared resolutely at the false front of Henderson's mercantile, his back to the stagecoach, to the woman, to the smile. Behind him, a low voice murmured, meant only for a neighbor's ear but carried on the still air. "He's made of stone." Cole heard it. He had heard it, or variations of it, 100 times before. He let the words wash over him, as meaningless as the whisper of the wind through dry grass. Stone did not feel, stone did not break, stone endured. He had made his peace with being stone. He dismounted, tied his horse, and went about his business. He bought his salt, his cartridges, his wire. He exchanged the necessary few words with Mr. Henderson, his voice a low rumble, rusty from disuse. He felt the town's eyes on him, but now they were also on the newcomer, their attention divided. He worked with a grim efficiency, loaded his supplies onto the buckskin, and prepared to leave the suffocating confines of Arroyo Mesa behind. As he mounted, the sun was beginning its descent, painting the western sky in violent streaks of orange and crimson. Against that fiery backdrop, a figure was tacking a freshly painted sign to the front of a small, empty building that had once been a laundry. It was Ava Mercer. The sign was simple, the black lettering neat and precise, Mercer's telegraph portraits. She was putting down roots. He watched her for a moment, a silhouette against the dying light. She worked with a steady, unhurried competence, her hammer strokes even and sure. She was alone, a woman with a strange trade in a strange town, and she showed no fear. Cole turned his horse toward the open country, toward the silence of the Dry Arrow. He spurred the animal into a steady trot, the rhythm a familiar comfort. He would not think of her. He would not think of the absurdly simple smile that had somehow found its way past his guard. She was just another drifter, another face that would soon be weathered by the same sun and scoured by the same dust that marked them all. He told himself he would forget her face, forget the clear gray of her eyes, before he even reached his own ranch gate. The miles fell away behind him. The sky deepened to indigo, and the first stars pricked the darkness. He rode into the yard of the Dry Arrow, the familiar shapes of the house and the new barn rising to meet him. He unsaddled his horse, gave him water and feed, and went inside the dark, empty house. He ate a cold meal of beans and bread, his motions mechanical. He cleaned his guns. He stared into the flame of his lantern until his eyes burned. But the wall of stone had a crack in it. That night, sleep did not come easy. He tossed in his cot, the worn wool blanket tangling around his legs. He was adrift in the restless sea between waking and dreaming. And the old ghosts came to him, as they always did. He was back in the smoke, thick and choking, the terrible heat scorching his lungs. He heard the panicked screams of the horses, the roar of the fire as it consumed the dry, seasoned wood of the old barn. He saw the orange light, the color of hell itself, and in the heart of the flames, he saw the faces of Sarah and Thomas, twisted in a final, silent agony. It was the nightmare that had stalked him for 5 years, a relentless torment from which there was no escape. But tonight, something new intruded upon the horror. Through the swirling, acrid smoke and the phantom flicker of the flames, another image appeared. It was clear and sharp, cutting through the chaos. It was a face, her face, and she was smiling. It was not a smile of malice or mockery. It was the same simple, quiet smile she had given him by the stagecoach, a small, bright beacon in the heart of his darkness. It did not belong there. It made no sense. But it burned brighter than the fire, a single, impossible point of light in the unending nightmare. Cole Maddox cried out, a raw, strangled sound, and woke up in the cold, silent dark, the ghost of a smile haunting him more than any flame. The Saturday market brought a fragile pulse to Arroyo Mesa. It was a day when the usual thick silence was thinned by the lowing of cattle in temporary pens, the clucking of hens in wicker cages, and the murmur of commerce. Ranchers from outlying spreads, prospectors down from the hills, and the town's own residents mingled in the wide, dusty street, their movements slow and deliberate under the morning sun. Ava Mercer was oblivious to the social currents swirling around her. For her, the day was about a different kind of connection. She stood on a tall ladder propped against the telegraph pole in front of her new establishment. A length of copper wire looped over her shoulder. Her sleeves were rolled to the elbow, revealing forearms that were slender but strong. Her focus was absolute. Her world narrowed to the ceramic insulator and the wire she needed to splice. With a steady hand, she scraped the ends of the wires clean with the keen edge of a small steel scalpel, a tool more suited to a surgeon than a telegrapher, but perfect for its precision. She twisted the copper together, her fingers moving with an ingrained, confident dexterity. The sun glinted off the metal, a bright spark in the dusty air. This was her work, her language. It was a language of circuits and currents, of messages sent across vast, empty distances. It was tangible, logical, and deeply satisfying. Across the street, Cole Maddox swung down from his buckskin in front of Henderson's Mercantile. He didn't come to town for market day gossip. He came for supplies, and his timing was merely a coincidence. As he looped the reins around the hitching rail, a ripple of awareness passed through the crowd. 2 young women, daughters of a nearby homesteader, were preening by the store's entrance, pretending to inspect a bolt of gingham. They giggled, their glances darting toward Cole like hummingbirds. One of them, the bolder of the 2, offered a bright, hopeful smile. Cole did not see it, or if he did, he gave no sign. He moved past them as if they were part of the architecture, a shadow detaching itself from the wall. His expression was unchanged, his gaze fixed on the doorway. The girl's smile faltered and fell, and she turned back to her friend with a frustrated sigh. Cole disappeared into the cool dimness of the store, the whispers trailing him like burrs on a saddle blanket. A few minutes later, Ava descended her ladder and entered the Mercantile herself. The air inside was thick with the smells of coffee beans, cured leather, pickling spices, and dry goods. Her eyes adjusted from the brilliant sun. She needed small screws, ones with a fine thread, to repair the leg of her camera tripod. As Mr. Henderson weighed them out for her, she made another request. "Mr. Henderson," she began, her voice calm and professional. "I need to run a secondary line from the main pole to my office. Just a thin ground wire. Would you mind if I attached a temporary anchor to the corner of your awning post? It won't bear any weight, and I'll remove it as soon as the permanent fixture arrives." Henderson, a man whose worldview was shaped by inventory ledgers and profit margins, stroked his beard. He looked at this self-possessed young woman and saw not an oddity, but a potential customer and a source of reliable communication with his suppliers in Santa Fe. "Long as it don't pull the post down," he grunted, and that was permission enough. As Ava stepped back out onto the boardwalk, a small commotion near the water trough caught her attention. A young sorrel colt, no more than a yearling, was favoring its front leg, hobbling in a pained circle. Its owner, a grizzled prospector reeking of cheap whiskey, was cursing at it, yanking on its lead rope. "Get on, you worthless piece of crowbait," the man slurred. The colt tossed its head, its eyes wide with pain and fear. Ava saw a dark patch of blood matting the hair on its cannon bone. Before she could say or do anything, a figure moved into the scene with a quiet, deliberate authority. It was Cole Maddox. He didn't speak to the prospector. He didn't acknowledge the small crowd that had begun to watch. He simply walked to the horse. He placed one large, calloused hand on the colt's neck, a firm but gentle pressure that seemed to drain the panic from the animal. He ran his other hand down the trembling leg, his touch impossibly light. The colt flinched but did not pull away. Then Cole knelt. He knelt in the dust and filth of the street, heedless of his clean denim trousers. His broad back was to the town, a wall against their curiosity. Ava, standing in the shade of the Mercantile's porch, found herself holding her breath. She watched as he produced a clasp knife from his pocket. He opened the blade and, with the focus of a watchmaker, began to work at the horse's leg. He extracted one long, wicked-looking cactus spine, then another and a third. He dropped them into the dust. The prospector stood by, mouth agape, suddenly sobered and ashamed into silence. From a pocket, Cole pulled a clean strip of cloth, likely torn from an old shirt. He carefully wrapped the small wounds, his movements efficient and sure. He gave the colt a final, reassuring pat on the shoulder, then stood up. He looked at the prospector, and his cold, river-stone eyes held a silent, unarguable command. The man mumbled something that might have been thanks and led the colt away. Its limp already noticeably eased. Cole turned, his face once again an unreadable mask. He seemed about to head for his own horse when Eva, distracted by the quiet drama, fumbled with a small paper bag of screws she held, the brass lens cap for her camera, which she'd been carrying in the same hand, slipped from her grasp. It hit the wooden boardwalk with a soft, metallic clatter and rolled, wobbling, into the dusty street. She let out a small sigh of frustration and bent to retrieve it. But before her fingers could reach it, a boot stopped its roll. It was a heavy leather boot, scuffed and stained with the red earth of his ranch, the sole worn smooth. Ava straightened up. Cole Maddox stood before her. He stooped in one fluid motion, his back still rigid, and picked up the lens cap. For a moment, he looked at the object in his palm, a circle of brass and felt. He then held it out to her. He did not look at her face. His gaze was fixed on her outstretched hand. He placed the cap into her palm, his calloused fingertips brushing against her skin for a fleeting, electric second. He said nothing. The silence stretched. It was Ava who broke it, her voice a little softer than she'd intended. "Thank you, Mr. Maddox," he grunted. It was a sound from deep in his chest, a minimal acknowledgement of her words. And then he was gone. He walked to his horse, swung into the saddle, and rode out of town, never looking back. Ava stood for a moment, the lens cap warm in her hand from his touch. The weight of it felt different, heavier. She looked down at it, then back at the empty space where he had stood. She had seen the whispers of the town made flesh, the cold, distant man who kept the world at arm's length. But she had also seen him kneel in the dirt for an animal in pain. She had seen the gentleness in his rough hands. The two images did not align. The town, however, saw only one thing in interaction. By the time Ava had secured her ground wire and returned to her shop, the story was already taking root. He picked it up for her. "Mrs. Henderson was telling the pastor's wife. Didn't say a word, mind you, but he picked it right up." The whispers spun and danced in the hot air, weaving a new narrative. The newcomer, the strange woman with her camera and telegraph keys, had managed to get a reaction from the man of stone, a new crack in the fortress. Ava ignored it all. She had no time for gossip. The life she had chosen for herself was built on skill and hard work, not on the idle chatter of others. She unfurled the heavy backdrop she'd brought with her, a large roll of painted cotton twill depicting a serene, cloudy sky. It took all her strength to hang it from the hooks she'd installed on the back wall of her small studio, the fabric smelling of oil paint and canvas. She arranged her posing chair, positioned her tripod, and fussed with the heavy wooden camera, feeling the familiar comfort of her tools. To test the light, she took a plate of the street outside her door. She disappeared into her small, curtained-off dark room, the air sharp with the scent of collodion and silver nitrate. A few minutes later, she emerged with a small glass plate, the image still wet and milky. It was a picture of Arroyo Mesa, captured in a moment of glaring, sun-bleached stillness. The heat seemed to rise from the image itself, the outlines of the buildings slightly blurred, as if melting into the sky. She carefully propped the test plate in her front window to dry, a small, ghostly advertisement for her trade. She spent the rest of the afternoon organizing, cleaning, and preparing. The sun began its slow journey westward, the shadows of the buildings stretching like long, dark fingers across the street. The air grew heavy, static. The usual afternoon breeze failed to appear. The sky, which had been a brilliant, cloudless blue, began to take on a sickly yellow-brown tinge at the western horizon. The experienced residents of Arroyo Mesa recognized the signs. They began to shutter their windows, to herd livestock into corrals, to secure loose items. A sudden, ominous silence fell over the town, the market day chatter replaced by a tense, watchful quiet. Ava, absorbed in her work, was one of the last to notice. She had stepped outside onto her small porch to sweep away the day's dust. She looked up and saw it. A monstrous, churning wall of brown was advancing across the plains, a solid mass that blotted out the mountains and devoured the sky. It was the first dust storm of the season, and it was moving with a terrifying speed. The wind hit first, a hot, violent gust that stole her breath and tore at her skirts, flinging grit into her eyes. She had left her camera outside. It stood on its tripod, a vulnerable wooden sentinel in the face of the oncoming storm. Her first instinct was to save it. She squinted against the stinging dust, her eyes watering. and lunged for it, her hands closing around the precious box just as the world disappeared. The storm hit Arroyo Mesa not like rain, but like a solid thing, a suffocating blanket of earth and wind that swallowed the sun and plunged the street into a roaring, brown twilight. Eva was caught in the open, blinded and choking, clutching her camera as the full force of the gale tried to tear it from her arms. The world dissolved into a maelstrom of grit and noise. The wind was no longer a current of air, but a solid, moving wall of earth that slammed into Eva, stealing her breath. Sand, fine and sharp as ground glass, scoured her skin and stung her eyes, forcing them shut. It was like being flayed by 1,000 tiny needles. She hunched over her camera, turning her back to the onslaught. The precious wooden box and its brass lens, her only concern. The street had vanished. Her own storefront, only yards away, was gone, swallowed by the churning brown chaos, blind and choking. She tasted dust in her throat, on her teeth. The roar was absolute, a deafening, constant howl that vibrated through the soles of her boots. She knew she couldn't make it back to her own shop. The door opened outward. She'd never get it open against this pressure. The nearest solid structure, the one she'd been looking at just moments before, was the stage station's cargo depot, a solid, low-slung adobe building with a heavy, sliding door, a fortress. Clutching the camera to her chest with one arm, using the other to shield her face, she stumbled forward. Each step was a battle. The wind shoved and tore at her, trying to rip the heavy box from her grasp. She lowered her head and pushed, moving on pure instinct, navigating by the memory of the ground beneath her feet. She collided with the rough adobe wall, the impact jarring her to the bone, groping along the gritty surface, her fingers raw. She found the edge of the large wooden door. It would be barred from the inside. It wouldn't budge. She was trapped. A surge of real fear, cold and sharp, cut through the adrenaline. Just as she was about to slump against the wall in defeat, the impossible happened. The door was wrenched open from within. It didn't slide smoothly. It was ripped back with a violent screech of wood on wood. Before she could process it, an arm, a solid bar of muscle, hooked around her waist. She was hauled, unceremoniously, out of the roaring darkness and into a deeper, quieter gloom. The door slammed shut behind her, the sound swallowed by the storm. A heavy wooden bar dropped into place with a solid, final thud. Silence. Or rather, the absence of the wind's direct assault. The demonic howl was now muffled, a constant, high-pitched moan from the other side of the thick walls. The air was still and thick. Sand, which had found its way through every crack, hissed against the adobe and rained down in fine streams from the rafters. The only light was a weak, diffuse brown glow that filtered through a single filthy window high on the wall. Eva stood gasping, her lungs burning, her heart hammering against her ribs. She was covered head to toe in a fine red powder. She blinked, her eyelashes heavy with it, and tried to see. A tall shape detached itself from the shadows beside the door. Cole Maddox. He said nothing. He simply stood there, letting her catch her breath. His presence filled the small space. In the dim light, he seemed even larger, a figure carved from the very earth and rock of the territory. The air between them was charged, heavy with the scent of the storm, the dry smell of dust. But beneath it, other scents clung to him, the faint, smoky aroma of black tea, the rich, honest smell of saddle leather, and the clean, metallic tang of oiled steel. Her first thought was for her camera. She looked down at it, brushing frantically at the fine dust that coated its wooden body and brass fittings. Cole moved. He crossed to a corner where a water barrel stood, dipped a corner of a burlap sack into it, and wrung it out. He came back and held it out to her. It was not an order, not quite a suggestion. It was a simple, practical offering. When she hesitated, still dazed, he took the initiative. He gently took the camera from her grip. His hands, which she had seen work with such rough purpose, were surprisingly careful, and placed it on a sturdy crate. Then he took the damp cloth and began to meticulously wipe the dust from the delicate instrument, his movements economical and precise. He paid special attention to the lens housing, his brow furrowed in concentration. Watching him, Ava felt the trembling in her own hands begin, the aftermath of fear. She needed to do something, to reclaim some sense of control. Her gaze fell upon her satchel, which was still slung over her shoulder. Inside, nestled amongst her other tools, was a small, portable spirit stove and a tin of tea. Without a word, she moved to a clear space on the floor. Away from the worst of the dust streams, she knelt, took out the small brass stove, filled it with alcohol, and struck a match. A tiny blue flame, a small circle of order in the chaos, flickered to life. She filled a small pot from her canteen and set it to boil. Her hands were shaking, but the familiar, methodical action steadied her. The minutes passed in a shared, unspoken truce against the storm. The only sounds were the shriek of the wind outside, the soft hiss of sand, and the tiny roar of her stove. When the water boiled, she brewed the tea, strong and black. The fragrant steam cut through the dusty air. She poured it into 2 tin cups. She took one to where he was still standing guard over her camera. He took the cup from her, his fingers brushing hers. He did not look at her, but at the dark liquid in the cup. They drank in silence. The hot, bitter tea was a comfort, a warmth that spread through her chest and pushed back the lingering chill of the storm. Finally, he spoke. His voice was a low rumble, rough from disuse. "You're alone here." It was a simple question, but it held layers she couldn't begin to parse. Was it an accusation of foolishness, a statement of fact, an expression of something akin to concern? She chose to answer it directly, meeting his gaze for the first time since he'd pulled her inside. His eyes, in the dim, dusty light, were dark and unreadable. "I am," she said, her voice steadier now. A small smile touched her lips, a flicker of the same defiant light he remembered from the day before. "And I haven't starved yet." The smile did it again. It wasn't a softening of his features. His face was too hard a landscape for that. It was more like a momentary halt, a brief interruption in the grim, relentless current of his thoughts. It was as if a gear that had been grinding for 5 years suddenly slipped, for just a second, into a different groove. His gaze faltered, dropping from her eyes to the tin cup in his hands. Outside, the storm seemed to redouble its fury. A violent gust hit the depot with the force of a battering ram, and the whole building shuddered. A loose piece of tin roofing rattled violently, the sound like a burst of gunfire. The sound, the shaking, the roar. It was a catalyst. Eva saw the change in him immediately. It was a flicker behind his eyes, a sudden, stark darkness that had nothing to do with the dim light of the room. The memory, always lurking just beneath the surface, broke free. The roar of the wind became the roar of the fire. The hissing sand became the hiss of water on hot ash. The rattling tin was the sound of the old barn's roof collapsing, a shower of sparks and flaming timbers against a smoke-blackened sky. The line of his jaw went rigid. His knuckles were white where he gripped the cup. He set it down on the crate with a sharp metallic clink. He stood up and turned away from her, pacing the short length of the room like a caged wolf. He ran a hand through his dusty hair, his broad back a wall of taut muscle. He was fighting a battle she could not see, suffocating on air thick with ghosts. Ava's first instinct was to speak, to ask the meaningless, necessary question, "Are you all right?" But the words died in her throat. She knew, with a certainty that was bone deep, that it was the wrong thing to do. This was a private grief, a wound so deep that the slightest touch of pity would feel like a hot brand. He had built his walls for a reason, and she would not try to tear them down with clumsy questions. Instead, she did the only thing she could. She picked up the teapot and walked quietly to where he had set his cup. She refilled it, the sound of the liquid pouring a small, gentle intrusion into the tense silence. She did not speak. She simply placed the full, steaming cup back on the crate, a silent offering, and returned to her own spot on the floor. It was an acknowledgement of his pain, and a profound respect for his privacy. Cole eventually stopped his pacing. He stood staring at the heavy wooden bar across the door as if he could see through it. To the ranch, to the small, windswept hill behind the house. He breathed deeply. Twice. When he finally turned back, the storm in his eyes had receded, locked away once more behind a mask of cold control. He saw the refilled cup. He didn't acknowledge it, but he picked it up and drained it in 2 long swallows. Slowly, the fury of the wind began to lessen. The roar subsided to a moan, then to a long, mournful sigh. The fine streams of sand from the rafters thinned and then stopped. A pale, watery light began to replace the brown gloom at the window. The storm was passing. Cole moved to the door and, with a single, powerful motion, lifted the heavy bar. He slid the door open a few feet. The air that rushed in was cool and clean, washed by the wind, smelling of damp earth and distant rain. The world outside was transformed, coated in a fresh layer of red dust, the light soft and strange. "The wind's dropping," he said, his back still to her. His voice was flat again. The brief moment of shared humanity sealed away. "I have to check the freight. You should get back." It was a dismissal, clear and final. The rescue was over. The truce was ended. Ava nodded, gathering her things. She packed her small stove and cups back into her satchel. She stood and walked to her camera, draping the damp sack over her shoulder. She was at the doorway, about to step back out into the newly scoured world, when she stopped. This couldn't be the end of it. The silence, the shared tea, the glimpse of the man behind the stone wall, it couldn't just evaporate into the dusty air. She turned. He was already moving toward a stack of crates at the far end of the depot. His focus already shifted to his work. "Mr. Maddox," she said, her voice clear and quick. Cutting through the quiet, he stopped, but he did not turn around. She took a breath. "I want to photograph your men, the hands at the Dry Arrow, before the fall roundup." She let the words hang in the air for a second before adding, "I pay for their time, of course, full rates." This made him turn. He shifted his weight, looking at her over his shoulder. His expression was one of wary surprise. He had expected her to leave. He had not expected a business proposition. She held his gaze, her own steady and direct. Her gray eyes were not asking for a favor. They were not attempting to breach his defenses with sentiment. They were the eyes of a professional stating her terms. They were waiting for a real answer, not for the wall he usually presented to the world. The question hung in the dusty, quiet air between them, demanding more than silence. It demanded a choice. Cole watched her for a long moment, his face a study in conflicting shadows. The silence in the depot was broken only by the sound of the wind sighing as it retreated across the plains. He had built a life on the principle of non-engagement, of keeping the world at a safe, unbreachable distance. Her proposal was a direct assault on that principle. It was business, professional and clean. Yet it felt like something more. It was an invitation, and he had not accepted an invitation in 5 years. The part of him that was stone, the part that was master of his lonely domain, wanted to refuse. But the man who had knelt in the dirt for a wounded horse, the man who had felt the phantom crack in his defenses from a simple smile, hesitated. "One afternoon," he said finally. The words clipped and rough, as if pulling them from his throat cost him something. No more. It was not a gracious acceptance, but it was an acceptance nonetheless. 3 days later, Ava Mercer guided a hired mule and a small buckboard wagon onto the track leading north out of Arroyo Mesa. The world had been scrubbed clean by the dust storm. The sky was a high, piercing blue, so vast and empty it seemed to have weight. A cool breeze, a welcome reprieve from the relentless heat, rustled the dry stalks of last season's grama grass, making a sound like whispering paper. Packed carefully in the back of the wagon, cushioned by burlap sacks stuffed with straw, were her tools: the heavy wooden camera, the sturdy tripod, a posing stool, and a leather case containing her precious, unexposed dry plates, each one a promise of a captured moment. The trail to the Dry Arrow was little more than 2 ruts carved into the earth, winding through a landscape of stark and lonely beauty. She passed stands of skeletal cholla cactus, their spines glittering in the sun, and broad swathes of yucca, their sharp green leaves a defiant splash of color against the red-brown earth. This was Cole Maddox's world. It was vast, quiet, and unforgiving. It shaped a man, she thought, or broke him. She was beginning to suspect that, in his case, it had done both. The ranch appeared suddenly, nestled in a wide, shallow valley that offered some protection from the wind. It was not a place of comfort or adornment. It was a place of work. A simple, sturdy log house stood beside a large, newer-looking barn, its unpainted pine already weathering to a soft silver gray. A tall windmill turned with a steady, rhythmic creak, pumping water into a large stock tank. A series of corrals, built from peeled cedar posts and wire, stood empty. The entire spread was an extension of the man himself, functional, austere, and built to endure. As she pulled the mule to a halt in the yard, a man emerged from the shade of the barn. He was shorter than Cole, wiry and tough, with a deeply tanned face and intelligent, dark eyes. He moved with the easy, bow-legged grace of a man who had spent his life in the saddle. He wiped his hands on a rag tucked into his belt and watched her approach, his expression a careful mixture of polite neutrality and wary assessment. This had to be the foreman. "Ma'am," he said, his voice carrying a slight accent. He gave a short, decisive nod. "Mr. Maddox is expecting you. I am Miguel Ortega." "Ava Mercer," she replied, hopping down from the buckboard. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mr. Ortega." She offered her hand. He hesitated for a fraction of a second before taking it, his grip firm and calloused. He was sizing her up, his loyalty to his employer evident in his guarded eyes. At that moment, Cole appeared on the porch of the main house. He had been watching. He descended the steps, his movements economical, his face giving nothing away. "Ortega, help Miss Mercer with her equipment." It was an order, but not an unkind one. Eva directed the placement of her gear, choosing the wide, open doorway of the barn as her studio. The interior of the barn was dark, smelling of hay, leather, and horses. It would provide the perfect contrasting backdrop. "If we could swing that door open," she said, pointing to the large sliding door on the east side. "About halfway. A 45-degree angle should be perfect." Cole and Miguel pushed the heavy door open. A blade of brilliant afternoon sunlight cut into the gloom, illuminating a wide swath of the packed earth floor. It struck the opposite interior wall, which was whitewashed, and bounced back, creating a soft, diffuse fill light. "Perfect," Ava said, more to herself than to them. She set up her camera, screwed it onto the tripod, and ducked under the dark cloth. Peering at the upside-down image on the ground glass, she saw the world transformed into a composition of light and shadow. Cole stood back, arms crossed over his chest, and watched. He said nothing, but his silence was attentive. He had always understood the sun in terms of hours for work, of heat on a cow's back, of the seasons. He had never seen it as a tool to be manipulated. He watched her measure the light with a small, hand-held meter, watched her adjust the angle of a white sheet she'd tacked to a crate to act as a reflector. She was not just taking a picture. She was bending the daylight to her will. She was an artisan, and he felt a grudging, silent respect for her command of her craft. Miguel gathered the ranch hands. There were 5 of them, lean, sun-scorched men with quiet eyes and hands as tough as old leather. They were awkward at first, unused to being the center of attention. They shuffled their feet, unsure of what to do with their hands. Ava's voice was calm and direct. "Just sit here," she told the first man, a young hand named Billy, indicating the posing stool. "Rest your hands on your knees. That's it. Now, forget I'm here. Think about your best horse." She worked with a focused intensity that put the men at ease. She didn't flatter them or make small talk. She treated the process with a seriousness that they, as working men, could understand and respect. She captured the details that told their stories, the deep rope burns on a wrist, the intricate tooling on a worn gun belt, the faded ink of a cattle brand tattooed on a forearm. The slow, deliberate process of photography the careful posing, the uncapping of the lens for the long exposure. The slide of the plate holder was a ritual. Gradually, the men's self-consciousness melted away. A quiet joke was told. A low, rumbling laugh broke the silence. Then another, fuller one. The barn, which had been Cole's silent domain, filled with a sound it had not heard in a long time. Cole remained by the wall, a silent observer. He watched the way she spoke to his men, the way she earned their trust not through charm, but through competence. He watched the way her brow furrowed in concentration under the dark cloth, the way she made a minute adjustment to a man's collar, her touch brief and professional. When the last hand had been photographed, a space of quiet fell over the barn again. Ava began to pack her plates. Cole pushed himself off the wall. "Come here," he said. The words an invitation that sounded like a command. He led her to a corner of the barn where several saddles rested on wooden stands. They were his work. He ran a hand over the tooled leather of the nearest one. "This is a simple running stitch," he said, his voice low. He traced a line of thick, waxed thread with his forefinger. "It's strong, holds a seam against steady pressure." He moved to the next saddle. "But here," he pointed to the stitching that joined the heavy skirt to the tree. "This is a box stitch, doubled back on itself 4 times at the corner. The plains get hail in the spring, hard as rocks. A running stitch will tear out if a horse panics and slams against a fence. This one won't." He spoke of his work with a quiet, unadorned passion. He explained the different weights of leather, the reasons for using brass rivets instead of steel in certain places, the way he shaped the wooden tree to fit the curve of a horse's back. Ava listened, fascinated. He was not just a rancher, he was a master craftsman. She saw in his hands the same deep, ingrained knowledge she felt in her own. They were 2 people who spoke the language of their tools. "It's beautiful work," she said softly. "For a composition, to add a sense of place to the portraits." She had been arranging some tools in the foreground. She picked up a worn leather bridle, its silver conchos dull with age. "This would be perfect," she murmured, holding it up. She tried to drape it over the corner of a hay bale, but it didn't hang quite right. "Here." Cole stepped forward, his proximity suddenly filling her senses. He was close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from him. He reached out, not for the bridle, but for her. His hand came to rest lightly on her shoulder, intending to shift her position to a better angle. "If you stand just—" His words trailed off. The moment his fingers made contact with the fabric of her dress, a current passed between them. It was a jolt, sharp and unexpected. For both of them, the world seemed to halt its rotation. The sounds of the ranch, the creak of the windmill, the distant nicker of a horse faded into a profound silence. All that existed was the light pressure of his hand on her shoulder. It was not a casual touch. It was a touch that carried the weight of 5 years of solitude, a touch that breached a wall he had thought was impregnable. Ava froze. Her breath caught in her throat. She could feel the strength in his hand, the calloused texture of his skin through the thin cotton. She was acutely aware of his nearness, of the scent of leather and dust and man. Cole's hand remained on her shoulder for a heartbeat too long. He looked down at where his hand met her body as if it belonged to someone else. His face, usually a mask of rigid control, was clouded with a raw, unguarded confusion. He snatched his hand back as if he'd touched a hot stove, taking a half step away. The silence that followed was thick and heavy, charged with everything that had not been said. Ava was the first to recover, turning back to her equipment, her movements a little too brisk. I think I have everything I need," she said, her voice not quite steady. She avoided his eyes. She packed her remaining gear, the easy atmosphere of the afternoon now gone, replaced by a tense, vibrating awareness. As she was loading the last of it into the buckboard, she turned to him. She had to ask, "Mr. Maddox, would you allow me to take your portrait as well for my collection?" He looked at her, and for a fleeting instant, she saw a flicker of something in his eyes, a longing, a weariness, a faint, Sad curve touched one side of his mouth, a ghost of a smile that never fully formed. It held more pain than his usual stony expression. "No," he said. The word was quiet, but absolute. She nodded. "Not pushing?" "Of course." She climbed onto the buckboard seat and picked up the reins. The sun was low, casting long shadows across the yard. Miguel and the other hands had discreetly made themselves scarce. It was just the two of them again, standing in the golden light. She was about to cluck to the mule when he spoke again, his voice so low she almost didn't hear it. "The Founders' Day festival is next week, in town." It was a simple statement of fact. Ava waited. "I won't be attending," he said. He was dismissing her again, reinforcing his isolation, stating for the record that nothing had changed. But as he said the words, his eyes, the color of a winter river, never left her face. They held her with an intensity that flatly contradicted the cold finality of his statement, leaving her with a question that had no answer. The afternoon at the Dry Arrow became the single most dissected event in Arroyo Mesa's recent history. The quiet hum of the town's gossip mill swelled to a steady drone. It was discussed over flour sacks at Henderson's Mercantile, debated over lukewarm beer at the saloon, and analyzed in hushed tones over picket fences. The photographer and Mr. Maddox. The words were always spoken together, a pairing so unlikely it was irresistible. She had spent the whole afternoon out at his ranch. He had been seen speaking to her. He had touched her shoulder. The stories grew with each telling, embellished with imagined glances and fabricated dialogues, until the simple act of a business transaction was transformed into a frontier romance of epic proportions. Ava heard the whispers. She felt the weight of the town's collective stare as she walked to the post office or bought groceries. She saw the way conversations paused when she entered a room, only to resume in a flurry of murmurs the moment she passed. She gave them nothing. She kept her expression placid, offered polite, brief greetings, and retreated into the sanctuary of her shop. There, in the red-tinged gloom of her dark room, the gossip of Arroyo Mesa could not reach her. She found her peace in the smell of chemicals, the gentle slosh of the developer in its tray, and the slow, magical emergence of an image on a glass plate. The world outside was loud with speculation. In here, it was silent, orderly, and under her control. A week after her visit to the ranch, the overland stage brought a letter. The envelope was crisp, the handwriting elegant and familiar. It was from back east, from Philadelphia. It was from a man named Arthur, a man to whom she had once been engaged. She opened it with a steady hand, her face illuminated by the light from her window. The letter was full of polite inquiries about her health, her journey, her unusual enterprise. But beneath the polished surface of the prose, the old arguments lingered. He wrote of a mutual friend's wedding, of the beautiful home they had built, of the children that were expected. "We all pray you will not grow weary of your adventure and will soon return to a life of more stability and comfort." A life of comfort. For Arthur, that meant a life prescribed. A life as his wife, the hostess of his dinner parties, the manager of his household. It meant giving up the heavy wooden camera, the acrid smell of collodion, the satisfying click of a telegraph key. He had seen her passion for her work not as a profession, but as a hobby, a charming eccentricity that she would eventually set aside for the more serious business of marriage. When she had refused, when she had chosen the vast, unknown territory of New Mexico over the gilded cage of Philadelphia society, he had not understood. He had called it a foolish, reckless whim. The breakup had been quiet, civilized, and deeply painful. The letter was a faint echo of that pain, a reminder of a life she had considered and rejected. She folded the pages neatly, the faint scar on her heart aching with a dull, familiar throb. She had chosen freedom, but freedom, she knew, often meant being alone, miles away, at the Dry Arrow. Cole Maddox was dealing with a more immediate and tangible threat. A rider from the county seat had delivered an official-looking document. It was a summons. Cole read it standing in the yard, the relentless sun beating down on his shoulders. The name on the document was Jedediah McCready. McCready owned the sprawling Rafter M Ranch, which bordered the Dry Arrow to the north. The summons was an injunction, a legal maneuver to prevent Cole from interfering with the Rafter M's water rights along Coyote Creek. Coyote Creek was the lifeblood of both ranches. It was a modest stream, fed by mountain snowmelt, but in this parched land, it was as precious as gold. For generations, an unspoken agreement had governed its use. But McCready was a new kind of rancher, a man who saw land and water not as a trust, but as a commodity to be exploited. For weeks, the flow of water reaching the Dry Arrow had been dwindling. Cole knew why. McCready was building a dam. A check dam, he called it. But it was nothing short of theft, slowly bleeding Cole's pastures dry. Now, McCready was using the law to sanctify his crime. Miguel Ortega came and stood beside him, reading the document over his shoulder. The foreman's face, usually calm, was grim. He spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "He is a snake. This one, he steals your water, then pays a lawyer in Santa Fe to say you are the thief. He's choking us off," Cole said, his voice a low growl. "The north pasture is already turning brown. You must go to the county court," Miguel advised, his tone serious. "You must fight him with the same papers he uses against you. Show the judge the old maps, the deeds." Cole folded the summons, the paper crinkling in his powerful hand. He nodded once. "I'll go." His eyes, fixed on the northern horizon where McCready's land began, darkened to the color of a thunderhead, a storm gathering on the inside. A few days later, a package arrived at the Dry Arrow from town. It was the finished portraits. Cole opened it in the evening, by the light of a single kerosene lamp. He laid the glass plates out on the rough-hewn table. Ava had captured his men perfectly. She had seen past their weathered exteriors to the quiet dignity within. Young Billy's bravado, another man's deep-set weariness, Miguel's steady, watchful intelligence, it was all there, etched in silver and light. At the bottom of the box, wrapped separately in a piece of soft flannel, was one more plate. It was not a portrait. There was no face. It was a photograph of his own hands, resting on the saddle he had shown her. The light from the barn door illuminated every detail: the scarred knuckles, the calloused pads of his fingers, the clean, strong line of the thumb as it lay against the tooled leather. The composition was simple, stark, and beautiful. It was a portrait of his work, of his skill, of a part of himself he rarely considered. He stared at the image for a long time. These were the hands that had buried his wife and son. They were the hands that had clenched into fists in helpless rage, the hands that had built walls to keep the world out. But in her photograph, they were not hands of violence or grief. They were the hands of a craftsman. They looked capable, patient. He saw, with a startling jolt of surprise, that they still knew how to be gentle. He had forgotten that. She had reminded him. The first sign of new trouble came 2 days later, not with a summons, but with a silence. Eva was at her telegraph key, trying to send a confirmation message to a supplier in Santa Fe. But the line was dead. The familiar rhythmic chatter of the circuit was gone, replaced by an empty, lifeless hum. She checked her connections, tested her battery, but the problem wasn't in her office. The break was somewhere to the north, on the long, lonely stretch of wire that linked Arroyo Mesa to the rest of the world. For a town on the frontier, the telegraph was more than a convenience. It was a lifeline. It carried news of cattle prices, warnings of Apache raids, messages of birth and death. An hour without it was an inconvenience. A day without it was a crisis. Eva did not wait for someone else to solve the problem. This was her wire, her responsibility. She put on a sturdy split skirt, pulled on her riding boots, and went to the livery to hire a horse. With a leather tool bag slung over her shoulder and a canteen of water, she rode out of town, following the line of cedar poles that marched across the open plains. It was a solitary journey. The world was a vast, empty bowl of earth and sky. The sun was hot, the wind a constant, dry pressure against her face. She rode for miles, her eyes scanning the copper wire overhead. looking for the telltale glint of a snapped line. The silence was immense, broken only by the plodding of her horse's hooves and the creak of saddle leather. She felt small, a single, moving speck in the enormous landscape, yet she felt no fear. There was a clean, sharp focus to her task that she found deeply satisfying. She found the break near the edge of Coyote Canyon. The wire hadn't snapped, it had been cut. The ends were clean, severed with a pair of heavy snips. It was deliberate, an act of sabotage. Anger, cold and clear, rose in her. This was an attack on her work, on the town's connection to the outside world. She set to work, her hands moving with practiced efficiency. She produced a length of spare wire, a small alcohol torch, and solder. It was a difficult repair, performed while standing precariously in the saddle. But within the hour, the line was spliced, the connection restored. As she was packing her tools, she heard a sound. It was a rhythmic, metallic clang, muffled by the distance and the vastness of the canyon. It was the sound of a hammer striking a steel spike. It came from further down the canyon, around a bend. Curiosity and a prickle of unease made her remount her horse. She rode slowly, keeping to the high ground along the canyon's rim, the sound growing louder and more distinct. She dismounted near a thick cluster of yucca plants, their spiky leaves providing excellent cover. Tying her horse's reins to a sturdy branch, she crept forward, her boots making no sound on the sandy soil. She peered over the rim of the canyon. Below her, in a narrow section of the creek bed, 3 men were working. They were building a dam, a crude but effective structure of heavy timbers and packed earth. It was already high enough to turn the once lively creek into a stagnant, muddy pool on their side, while only a pathetic trickle of water was allowed to pass downstream. This was McCready's illegal dam. This was the reason the Dry Arrow was going dry. She watched the men, her heart pounding with a mixture of anger and apprehension. One of them turned, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of a dirty glove. He was a big, loutish man with a week's worth of stubble on his jaw. And Ava recognized him. She had seen him 2 days earlier, riding hard on the trail north out of Arroyo Mesa, a pair of heavy wire cutters hanging from a loop on his saddle. The man who had cut her telegraph line was one of the men stealing Cole Maddox's water. The 2 acts of sabotage were not a coincidence. They were connected. And now, so was she, kneeling in the abrasive dust behind the yucca. Ava worked with the cold precision of a cartographer. Her mind, trained to see the world in lines and connections, was mapping the scene below. She took note of the dam's position relative to a distinctive rock formation on the opposite canyon wall, a formation that looked like a hawk in profile. She piled 3 small, flat stones, one on top of the other, just at the edge of the rim, a discreet cairn that marked her vantage point. This was not just sabotage. It was a strategic move in a war she now understood she was a part of. The sun was bleeding across the western horizon, and the sky was turning a deep, bruised purple. She had to move fast. She crept back to her horse, her movements swift and silent. Once in the saddle, she didn't ride. She fled, pushing the hired animal harder than she liked. The fading light created a treacherous landscape of long, deceptive shadows. She followed the telegraph line, a thin, dark thread stitching the darkening plains together, her one guide back to the world of men and laws. As she navigated a steep, shale-covered slope that offered a shortcut, the horse's back legs slipped. The world tilted violently. There was a sickening lurch, the scrape of iron horseshoes on stone, and the horse's panicked grunt. Ava was thrown from the saddle. Her reaction was pure instinct, a muscle memory honed by years of handling fragile glass plates. She twisted her body in midair, curling around her heavy tool bag, protecting the delicate instruments within. She hit the ground hard, her left arm taking the brunt of the impact. A sharp, searing pain shot from her wrist to her shoulder. For a moment, the world went black at the edges, the pain a nauseating wave. She lay still, grit pressed into her cheek, listening to the frantic scrambling of the horse as it found its footing. She took a breath, then another. The pain in her wrist was a sharp, insistent scream. She pushed herself up, her left hand useless, a dead weight. She cradled it against her chest. Her tools were safe. That was her first anchoring thought. She found the horse, its eyes still wide with fear, and soothed it with a low voice, her good hand stroking its neck. Getting back into the saddle was an agonizing, clumsy ordeal, but she managed it. Her teeth clenched against the waves of pain. By the time she reached Arroyo Mesa, the town was a collection of faint yellow lights under a canopy of brilliant, cold stars. She ignored the livery, tying the horse loosely in front of her shop. Inside, the first thing she did was light a lamp. Then, with her one good hand, she went to the telegraph key. The message was already composed in her head, stripped down to its essential facts. County Sheriff, Bernalillo, stop illegal dam construction. Coyote Canyon, North Fork, Section 12, Dry Arrow Ranch Waterway, obstructed stop, McCready Ranch hands on site. Stop line, sabotage confirmed. Same location, stop, urgent action required. Stop, Mercer, Arroyo Mesa, stop. The clicks echoed in the silent room, sharp and urgent. A desperate pulse sent out into the vast and dark expanse of the territory. At the Dry Arrow, a different kind of vigil was being kept. Cole sat at his heavy pine table, a single lantern casting a pool of harsh yellow light that threw his face into a stark relief of angles and shadows. The ranch ledgers were open before him, pages of neat, spidery script detailing 20 years of rainfall, water usage, and cattle counts. Beside them, rolled out and weighted down with stones, were the old territorial survey maps, the boundary of his land clearly marked, the winding blue line of Coyote Creek unambiguous. He was preparing for a war, but his weapons were facts and figures, history and law. He hadn't slept. His eyes burned with exhaustion, but his focus was absolute. Miguel sat in a chair in the corner, cleaning a rifle, his presence a silent, unwavering testament of support. He did not speak, but his quiet industry said everything that needed to be said. You are not alone in this fight. The next morning, Ava was at the county clerk's office when it opened. Her left wrist was tightly bound in a makeshift splint of wood and cloth, the pain a constant, dull throb. She had spent the pre-dawn hours not sleeping, but working. With her good hand, she had taken one of the wide-view photographs she had taken from a high ridge on her journey to the ranch and had used it as a reference. On a clean sheet of paper, she had made a detailed, top-down drawing. It was not the work of an artist, but of a technician. It showed the precise course of Coyote Creek as it crossed from McCready's land onto the Dry Arrow. It showed the location of the illegal dam, marked with a neat X, referenced against the Hawkhead rock formation she had seen. It was a map, an unimpeachable piece of evidence. She handed the drawing to the clerk, a harried man with ink stains on his fingers. This is for the hearing regarding the McCready-Maddox water dispute, she said, her voice steady despite her exhaustion and pain. It's a survey based on a recent photograph of the area. The clerk, accustomed to dealing in dry deeds and legal jargon, looked at the clear, concise drawing with surprise and relief. It was the kind of hard evidence a judge could understand. The hearing was swift, presented with Eva's map alongside Cole's historical ledgers. The judge had little choice. Jedediah McCready, a bull of a man with a florid face and eyes like angry little stones, was forced to listen as a temporary injunction was read aloud. The stop work order was immediate and absolute. McCready lost. For now. As he stormed out of the small courthouse, he passed Cole in the hallway. He stopped, his bulk blocking the light. "This ain't over, Maddox," he growled, his voice low and full of menace. "You and your friends will find that paper won't stop a determined man." It was not a threat of another lawsuit. It was a promise of a different kind of justice. Cole returned to the Dry Arrow, the small victory feeling hollow and temporary. He knew McCready. The man would not be bound by the law. That afternoon, he learned from the clerk, who had been deeply impressed, that the decisive piece of evidence the map had been provided by Miss Mercer, the new telegrapher. The knowledge hit Cole with the force of a physical blow. She had ridden out, found the break, discovered the dam and acted. She had done it on her own, for reasons he could not begin to guess. She had entered his fight without being asked, had stood with him without him even knowing. The fortress of his solitude, already cracked, suddenly seemed like a pathetic, flimsy thing. He was a fool, a cold, ungrateful fool. He sat at his table again, but this time it was not a ledger he reached for. It was a clean sheet of paper, a pen, and a bottle of ink. The pen felt foreign and awkward in his hand, a tool of words, not work. He wrote, crossed out, and started again. He was a man of few words, and putting them on paper was a torment. Finally, he settled on a few simple, brutally honest lines. He folded the paper, sealed it in an envelope, and addressed it to Miss Eva Mercer, Telegraph Portraits, Arroyo Mesa. He gave it to the boy who delivered the weekly newspaper, along with a coin. "See she gets this right away," he said. The letter arrived at Ava's shop just as she was finishing a more professional splint for her wrist. She heard the boy's knock and opened the door. He handed her the envelope. She saw the name Maddox was not on the return, but she recognized the stark, strong handwriting from a feed store receipt she had once seen. Her heart gave a curious, unexpected leap. She was holding a part of his silence, a message from the man of stone. She was about to open it when the telegraph key began to chatter. It was a frantic, irregular clicking. A rancher from the South Line. His wire was down. Wind, he thought, but he wasn't sure. Forever. There was no choice. The line was her responsibility. The letter could wait. Her duty could not. She slid the unopened envelope into the pocket of her work apron, grabbed her tool bag, and headed out the door, her personal feelings tucked away like the letter itself. That night, a deep, starless dark fell over Arroyo Mesa. Eva was working late, developing the plates from the dry arrow, her shop lit by the soft, safe glow of a red lantern. She was tired. Her wrist ached, but the work was a solace. Suddenly, a sharp, cracking sound, followed by the musical, terrifying tinkle of shattering glass. She froze, her heart leaping into her throat. The front window. She blew out the lantern, plunging the room into absolute darkness. She stood motionless, listening. The only sound was the frantic beating of her own heart and the whisper of the night wind through the broken pane. There were no footsteps, no voices, just a single, violent act of intimidation. After a long, silent minute, she moved. She found a match and relit her main lamp. The large plate glass window was a spiderweb of cracks radiating from a single, dark hole. On the floor, amidst a glittering carpet of broken glass, lay a heavy, jagged rock. Her first reaction was not fear, but a slow, burning anger. They thought this would scare her away. They thought she was just another fragile woman who would run at the first sign of trouble. She didn't call for the marshal, who was likely drunk and useless anyway. She found a broom and a dustpan. With her one good hand, she began the slow, methodical work of cleaning up the mess. When the last shard of glass was swept away, she did not board up the window. Instead, she went to her storeroom and brought out 2 more lanterns. She lit them and placed them in the empty window frame, their bright, defiant flames pushing back against the menacing darkness outside. She would not be cowed. She would not hide. High on the mesa north of town, in a hollow hidden from the main trail, another kind of light flickered. A campfire cast dancing shadows on the hard, angry faces of Jedediah McCready and 5 of his men. The man who had cut Eva's wire was there, passing a bottle of whiskey. "The judge thinks his piece of paper can stop us." McCready sneered, his voice thick with resentment. "We'll show him what real power is. Tomorrow night, we finish the job. We'll shore up that dam so a flood couldn't take it down." "And Maddox?" one of the men asked. McCready's lips curled into a cruel smile. "After the dam is secure, we'll pay a visit to the Dry Arrow, teach him a lesson about interfering with his betters. And we'll stop by that new telegraph office, too. It's time someone explained to the lady photographer that some things are not her concern." The wind picked up, carrying his low, brutal words away into the darkness. The next evening, just as twilight was settling over the Dry Arrow Ranch, came the sound of a horse being ridden at a full, desperate gallop. It wasn't the steady, loping pace of a returning hand. This was the sound of terror. Cole and Miguel, who were in the corral, both turned as one. A lone rider burst into the ranch yard, his horse lathered in sweat, its sides heaving. It was one of Miguel's cousins, who worked a small homestead near the canyon. He vaulted from the saddle before the horse had even stopped, his eyes wide with fear. He stumbled toward Miguel, gasping for breath. "They are gathering," he cried, his voice hoarse with panic. "McCready and his men, they have tools and guns. They are going to the dam tonight, they said after that. They are coming here." Miguel's face went rigid. He turned to Cole, his expression grim. "Patron," he said, his voice low and urgent. "They will hit the dam tomorrow night. We need men, and we need a plan." The night of the Founders' Day festival arrived on a wave of cool, dry air. A fragile truce seemed to settle over Arroyo Mesa, a collective, unspoken agreement to set aside worries and hardships for a few precious hours. For Ava, the day had been long, the ache in her sprained wrist a constant, nagging reminder of the violence simmering just beneath the surface of the territory. She was exhausted, bone-weary from the tension of the past week. Yet she found herself on a ladder in the town's main street, helping the Henderson boys string paper lanterns between the awning posts. She wanted this for the town. She wanted to see faces softened by lantern light instead of hardened by suspicion. She wanted to hear music, not the sound of shattering glass. It was a small act of defiance, a vote of confidence in the possibility of peace. When she was done, the street was transformed into a corridor of warm, glowing colors, the lanterns bobbing gently in the evening breeze like captured moons. The festivities were held in the livery stable, cleared of horses and wagons for the night. The vast space, usually smelling of hay and animals, was now filled with the scent of roasted corn, sweet cider, and the clean, starched cotton of Sunday-best dresses. A trio of musicians, a fiddler, a guitarist, and a man with a concertina sawed away at a lively reel from a makeshift stage of stacked hay bales. The floor was a swirl of color and movement, the stomp of boots and the rustle of calico keeping time with the music. Ava stood near the wide-open doors, content to watch. She had no desire to dance, not with her wrist throbbing. She was an observer by nature and by trade, and she found a quiet satisfaction in the tableau of the community coming together. She saw young couples stealing shy glances, old-timers telling tall tales, and children chasing each other through the crowd like wild little sprites. It was a fragile, beautiful thing, this moment of shared joy. And then she saw him. He was standing on the far side of the room, near a table laden with pies. The entire town seemed to hold its breath for a second. It was Cole Maddox, but it was a Cole she had never seen before. The dusty, trail-worn clothes were gone, replaced by a clean, dark shirt and a simple black vest that emphasized the formidable width of his shoulders. His hair was damp and combed back from his face, and he was clean-shaven. The absence of the rough stubble that usually shadowed his jaw was a startling transformation. It revealed the true, hard line of his mouth and the stark, handsome planes of his face. He looked younger, and somehow more vulnerable. He hadn't come to town for supplies. He had come for this. It was a deliberate act, a statement. He held his dark Stetson in his hands, turning the brim slowly, his eyes scanning the crowd with an unnerving stillness. The whispers started immediately, a low buzz that followed his gaze. He ignored them. His eyes found Ava across the crowded room, and, for a long moment, the noise and movement of the festival seemed to fade away for both of them. He held her gaze, and then, with a slow, deliberate purpose, he began to walk toward her. The crowd parted for him, as if by magic. He moved through the dancers without touching anyone, a dark, solitary rock in a swirling river. He stopped in front of her, the fiddler, as if sensing a shift in the very gravity of the room, drew his bow across the strings in a long, mournful note, and the lively reel slowed, softened, and melted into a waltz. The tempo of the entire evening changed. Cole placed his hat on a nearby barrel. "Miss Mercer," he said, his voice a low rumble that was almost lost in the music. "Mr. Maddox," she replied, her own voice surprisingly steady. "I was told you wouldn't be attending." "I changed my mind," he said simply. He looked at the dancers, then back at her. "I don't know how to do this." It was a confession, a raw admission of inadequacy that was more eloquent than any flowery speech. Ava felt the last of her own weariness fall away, replaced by a strange, buoyant warmth. A small, genuine smile touched her lips. "Neither do I," she said softly. "We can be clumsy together." For the first time, she saw the ghost of a smile answer her own. It was not the pained, fleeting curve she had seen at the ranch. This was a real, if small, shift in the hard line of his mouth, a spark of light in the darkness. "All right," he said. He held out his hand. Ava looked down at it. It was the hand she had photographed, the hand that knew how to be gentle. She placed her good right hand in his. His grip was firm, calloused, and surprisingly warm. He led her onto the floor, into a space that the other dancers had instinctively cleared for them. His other hand came to rest on the small of her back. The touch was proper, correct, but it sent a jolt of heat through the thin fabric of her dress. She placed her bandaged left hand lightly on his shoulder. They stood there for a moment, two solitary figures in the center of the floor, the gentle, three-beat rhythm of the waltz swirling around them. Their first steps were as clumsy as she had predicted. He was stiff, unused to this kind of movement, and she was tentative, favoring her injured wrist. They nearly collided with another couple, but they didn't stop. They looked at each other, a silent, shared acknowledgement of their own awkwardness. And they kept trying. Slowly, something shifted. He began to feel the music, to let it guide his feet. She began to trust him, to follow his lead. Their hesitant steps smoothed out, found the rhythm, and fell into sync. The world outside of their small circle began to dissolve. The faces of the onlookers, the paper lanterns, the music itself, it all blurred into a warm, indistinct haze. All that was real was the solid presence of the man in front of her, the pressure of his hand on her back, and the steady, serious gaze of his eyes. They moved as one, two separate people who had somehow, against all odds, found a shared rhythm. They didn't speak. There was no need for words. The dance was its own language, a conversation of touch and movement. As they turned through the pools of soft lantern light, he leaned in, his mouth close to her ear, the warmth of his breath on her skin. "A wall that protects," he whispered, his voice rough with an emotion she couldn't name, "is also a prison." It was the truest thing he had ever said, a confession that laid his entire wounded soul bare. Ava's heart ached for him, for the 5 years he had spent inside that prison. "And the key," she whispered back, her voice just as soft, "is held by another, not by the wall." He pulled back slightly, his eyes searching her face in the dim light. He understood. He saw the key she was offering. The music swelled, a long, sweet, aching melody from the fiddle. He drew her closer, the space between them disappearing until their bodies were almost touching. Her head tilted back, his leaned down. The music, the light, their heartbeats, it all seemed to converge on this single, inevitable point. Their lips were inches apart, the air thick with the promise of a kiss 5 years in the making. Crack! The sound was sharp, brutal, and utterly alien. It was the sound of a rifle shot, echoing from the hills to the north. The music died in a discordant screech. The dancers froze. A woman screamed. The entire fragile bubble of the festival burst, leaving behind a cold, ringing silence. Then, chaos. The stable doors burst open, and Miguel Ortega stumbled in, his face pale, his eyes wild. "The dam!" he yelled, his voice raw with panic. "It's McCready, they're at the dam!" The townspeople panicked, shouting, scrambling, their momentary joy replaced by a primal, frontier fear. But Cole didn't move. In the instant the shot was fired, his hand, as if by pure reflex, had left Ava's back and closed around her good hand, his fingers lacing with hers. It wasn't a romantic gesture. It was an anchor in the storm, an instinctive claiming of an ally. He turned to her, his face once again a hard mask, but this time it was the mask of a commander, not a hermit. His eyes were clear, focused, all traces of vulnerability gone. "We need a signal," he said, his voice cutting through the din. "A way to coordinate. We need a guide who can get above them." Ava didn't hesitate. The near kiss, the dance, it was all gone, burned away by the urgency of the moment. She was a professional again. She met his gaze, her own just as focused. "I have the telegraph battery," she said, her voice clear and strong. "And a signal lantern. I know the path to the canyon rim, the one with the Hawkhead Rock." He nodded once. A sharp, decisive movement. A plan formed between them in that single, shared glance. They turned as one and ran, pushing their way through the terrified crowd. His hand still locked with hers. They burst out of the livery stable and into the cold night air. The paper lanterns, which had looked so festive moments before, now seemed like pale, helpless ghosts. They ran for the horses, a man who had forgotten how to fight and a woman who had just shown him the way out of his prison, charging headlong into a different kind of war. As their horses thundered out of town, kicking up dust that glittered like fallen stars in the moonlight, they looked to the north. On the dark slope of the hills, a line of torches moved with sinister purpose, a fiery serpent slithering through the night, its destination the fragile dam that was the lifeblood of the valley. The ride to the canyon was a frantic, breathless charge through a landscape of silvered moonlight and deep, black shadows. There was no conversation, only the thunder of hooves, the creak of saddle leather, and the shared, urgent rhythm of their breathing. The festive paper lanterns of Arroyo Mesa were a distant, forgotten dream. Ahead, the line of McCready's torches crawled up the dark hillside like a malevolent centipede, a clear and present declaration of war. They reined in their horses in a grove of cottonwoods a quarter-mile from the dam, the sound of shouting and the clang of hammers on steel now audible on the night wind. A handful of men from the town, ranchers and shopkeepers who had grabbed rifles and followed, gathered around them, their faces grim in the moonlight. Miguel Ortega slid from his saddle, his movements all business. "Javier, Thomas, you take the east abutment. Henderson, you and your boy take the west. They'll try to set charges there first. Don't let them get close." He spoke with the quiet authority of a man who knew the geometry of a fight. Cole dismounted, pulling his Winchester from its scabbard. "The rest of you, with me, we're not going in head-on. We'll circle around, come at them from the high ground on their flank. Keep them occupied. Keep them off that dam." He turned to Ava. The chaos of the moment had stripped away everything but the essential. He saw not a woman, not a photographer, but a soldier in his small, desperate army. "Can you make the climb?" he asked, his voice low, his eyes fixed on the dark silhouette of the Hawkhead Rock that loomed over the canyon. "I can make it," she said, her voice devoid of any tremor. She was already unstrapping her equipment from her saddle, a heavy glass cell battery in a wooden case, a coil of thin copper wire, and a signal lantern with a focused lens and a simple shutter mechanism. "Good," was all he said. Then he and his small group of men melted into the shadows, moving with a hunter's silence toward the ridge. Ava was alone. She looked up at the rock formation, a sheer cliff face on this side. The path she knew was a narrow, treacherous goat trail that wound its way up the back, with her injured wrist sending jolts of pain up her arm with every movement. The climb was a slow, agonizing ordeal. She tucked the heavy battery under her good arm, slung the wire and lantern over her shoulder, and began to ascend. She focused on her breathing, on the placement of each foot, ignoring the fire in her wrist. The sounds of the confrontation below grew louder, angry shouts, the splintering of wood. She could not afford to fail. Finally, breathless and slick with sweat, she pulled herself onto the flat ledge at the top. The entire scene was laid out below her like a military map. The flickering torchlight illuminated Macready's men swarming over the half-finished dam, their shadows long and grotesque. On either side, she could just make out the dark shapes of Miguel's defenders, crouched behind rocks, and high on the ridge to her left, she saw the faint, metallic glint of a rifle barrel Cole's position. She worked with a surgeon's focus. She placed the battery, attached the copper wire to its terminals, and ran the other end to the lantern's switch. She checked the shutter. It moved with a satisfying, clean click, using a small pouch of sand as a weight. She positioned the lantern at the very edge of the cliff, its lens aimed directly at Cole's flanking position. The plan they had conceived in a single, silent glance was now a reality. She was the nerve center, the eye in the sky. She took a deep breath and depressed the key. Click-clack. A long flash of white light. Then a short one. The letter L in Morse code. Left. On the ridge. A shadow moved. Cole was repositioning his men. Below, one of Macready's men pointed up at her. "Hey, there's someone up there!" A chorus of curses rose from the dam. A rifle cracked, the sound echoing flatly in the canyon. A bullet whined past Eva's head and ricocheted off the rock behind her with a sharp, angry buzz. She flinched but held her position. Another shot, this one kicking up a shower of dirt and stone fragments just to her right. They were trying to frighten her, to drive her from her post. "From the ridge!" Cole's voice boomed, a raw, powerful command that cut through the noise. "Hold your fire! Nobody fires first!" Even from this distance, Ava could feel the iron certainty in his voice. He was right. A full-blown gunfight would tear the town apart, leaving wounds that would never heal, regardless of who controlled the water. This had to be won with something other than bullets. She pressed the key again. Click, clack, click, click. Right. She had spotted a group of men trying to sneak around Miguel's eastern position. Suddenly, she heard a noise behind her, the scrape of a boot on stone. She whirled around, her heart seizing in her chest. A large figure was scrambling up the final few feet of the trail, his face contorted with effort and malice in the dim moonlight. It was the wire cutter, the big, loutish man from the dam. He had circled around, intending to silence her for good. He lunged for her, his hand reaching for the lantern. There was no time to think, no time for fear. Her good hand shot out and grabbed the one tool she had at her disposal, the small, heavy sandbag she was using to anchor the lantern. She swung it with all her might. It caught him square in the chest with a dull, solid thud. He grunted, a sound of pained surprise, his eyes wide. His forward momentum was broken. His feet, already on unstable ground, slipped with a strangled cry. He lost his balance and tumbled backward down the steep trail, crashing through the scrub brush. A moment later, two figures appeared at the bottom of the trail. One was the wire cutter, struggling to his feet. The other was Miguel Ortega, who must have seen the man break away. Miguel was on him in an instant, subduing him with a swift, brutal efficiency that left the larger man gasping on the ground. A new sound drew Ava's attention back to the dam, a low, ominous roar. The water, held back by the crude structure, had finally risen too high. A dark sheet of it was beginning to pour over the top, threatening to breach the entire dam and send a catastrophic flash flood down the valley. They had to release the pressure. Cole had told her about an old, half-forgotten emergency sluice gate built into the canyon wall, a relic from a previous attempt to irrigate the valley. It was operated by a large iron wheel, but the signal to open it had to be unmistakable. Ava reached into her tool bag and pulled out a heavy brass railroad whistle. She put it to her lips and blew, a high, piercing shriek that cut through the night, a sound of pure, mechanical urgency that could not be mistaken for anything else. Once, twice, 3 times. Down below, she saw one of Miguel's men. "Javier, react!" He broke from cover, running not toward the fight, but toward the canyon wall. He threw his entire body against the huge, rust-frozen wheel of the sluice gate. It groaned, then slowly, reluctantly, began to turn. A section of the canyon wall slid open, and a torrent of water erupted from it, relieving the pressure on the dam. Just then, The sound of multiple horses approaching at a gallop echoed from the south. A voice yelled, "In the name of the territory of New Mexico, lay down your arms." The county sheriff and a posse of deputies rode into the torchlight, their revolvers drawn. The fight was over. McCready, seeing the law and seeing his men being systematically outmaneuvered, threw down his rifle in disgust. The dam was saved. The water was flowing. The town was safe. A wave of exhaustion so profound it was almost painful washed over Eva. She sank to her knees on the cold rock, her entire body trembling. Later, as the sheriff's men were cuffing a sullen McCready and his crew, Cole Maddox walked through the muddy, chaotic scene at the base of the dam. His men were weary but unharmed. He was looking for someone. He found her near the sluice gate. The lantern light cast a flickering, dramatic glow. She was kneeling in the mud beside Javier, the man who had opened the gate. His hand had been scraped raw on the rusty wheel, with her one good hand. Eva was carefully rewrapping the splint on her own injured wrist, her movement slow but steady, her face smudged with dirt and grime. But her eyes, when she looked up and saw Cole approaching, were as clear and calm as a morning sky. He stopped a few feet away from her. The sounds of the deputies and the receding water faded into the background. All he could see was her. He saw the strength that had carried her up a cliff in the dark. He saw the ingenuity that had turned a lantern into a general's command post. He saw the compassion that made her tend to another's wound while she herself was in pain. He saw the woman who had, in the space of a few short weeks, broken through every defense he had spent 5 years building, and something inside him, a mechanism rusted shut by grief and time, finally broke free. The muscles around his mouth, tight and hard for half a decade, softened. His lips, which had forgotten the shape of joy, parted. It wasn't a large expression. It was a small, quiet, utterly genuine smile that reached all the way to his tired eyes, lighting them from within. It lasted for more than a single, fleeting breath. Eva saw it. She stared for a moment, as if seeing a miracle. A slow, weary smile of her own answered his. "So," she said, her voice a soft, tired murmur, "you do know how." He kept smiling, the expression feeling both strange and profoundly right on his face. "Someone taught me," he said. The first hint of dawn was beginning to paint the eastern sky a pale, translucent purple. The long night was over. Cole looked at her, kneeling there in the mud, and felt a sudden, desperate urge to tell her everything. He wanted to tell her what he had tried to write in the letter, the clumsy words of thanks and apology, the admission that he no longer wanted to live only half a life. But he stopped, a sudden, cold realization dawning on him. In the chaos of the cut wires and the broken window, she had never even had a chance to read it. The Sunday that followed was a day of profound and heavy stillness. The sky was a pale, washed-out blue, and the air held a strange, humid weight, a premonition of the summer rains to come. Arroyo Mesa was quiet, its residents either at the small adobe church or recovering from the festival and the subsequent night of high drama. Cole Maddox rode into town not with the grim purpose of a man seeking supplies, but with the quiet, nervous determination of a pilgrim. He had spent the hours since dawn in a state of suspended animation, his mind replaying the moment of his smile, the sight of her kneeling in the mud, her eyes clear and steady. The wall he had lived behind for 5 years had not just been breached, it had been leveled, and he was left standing in the rubble, blinking in a new and terrifying light. He reached her shop. The door was closed, the sign still and silent. He dismounted, his movement stiff. In his hand, he clutched a new envelope, the second letter he had written in as many days. This one had been harder to write than the first. It contained not just an apology, but a question, a hope so fragile he was afraid the morning light might shatter it. He did not knock. It was early yet, and after the night she had endured, she needed her rest. So he waited. He stood by his horse, his back to the street, his gaze fixed on her door. He was a patient man. He had learned to wait through long winters, through droughts, through the endless, slow passage of his grief. But this waiting was different. It was an active, agonizing thing. A wire pulled taut inside his chest. He was utterly exposed, with no fortress to retreat to, and the feeling was both terrifying and strangely liberating. An hour passed. The sun climbed higher. The heat began to build. Finally, he heard the sound of a bolt being drawn back inside. The door opened. Ava stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the dim interior of her shop. She had a fresh, clean bandage wrapped expertly around her wrist. She looked tired, the skin around her eyes shadowed with exhaustion. But when she saw him standing there, a flicker of surprise, and something else he couldn't name, lit her face. "Mr. Maddox," she said, her voice soft. He simply nodded, unable to speak, his throat tight. He held up the letter in his hand, a silent offering, but she didn't look at it. Instead, she reached into the pocket of the clean apron she wore and pulled out the first letter, the one he had sent with the newsboy. It was slightly crumpled, as if it had been held in a tight fist. "I kept this with me all night," she said, her voice quiet but clear, each word distinct in the morning stillness. "Through everything, I'm ready to read it now." She did not invite him in. Instead, she gestured to the simple wooden bench on her small porch. They sat, a respectable distance between them, the unopened second letter resting on the bench beside Cole's hand. Ava carefully unfolded the single sheet of paper. Cole watched her, his heart hammering against his ribs. He felt as though he were a defendant in a courtroom, awaiting a verdict that would decide the entire course of his future. She began to read. The world narrowed to the sight of her gray eyes moving over his clumsy, heartfelt script. "Miss Mercer, I write this because I do not have the skill to say it. Thank you. For the map, for the signal, for standing when any sensible person would have run. You did not have to enter my fight, and you did. I am sorry. For my coldness, for the silence, for the walls I have built. I see now that they were meant to keep the pain in, but they have also kept all the light out. For 5 years, I have been a man living in the past, a ghost in my own house. I see now that is not living at all. I do not want to live half a life anymore. Yours, Cole Maddox." She read it once, then again, her expression unreadable. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. Cole could hear the blood pounding in his ears. He had laid his soul bare on that piece of paper, offering her the broken pieces of himself. He had no idea if she would accept them or turn away in pity or disgust. Finally, she looked up from the letter, her eyes luminous. She didn't say thank you. She didn't say it was all right. She simply looked at him, and in her gaze, he saw not pity, but a profound and absolute understanding. She had seen the man behind the stone, and she was not afraid. Slowly, Cole reached into the small pocket of his vest. His fingers, usually so steady when handling leather or steel, felt thick and clumsy. He pulled out a small object and placed it in his palm. It was a ring. It was not an ornate, glittering thing from an Eastern jeweler's case. It was a simple, solid band of hammered silver, and set into it was a single, smooth stone of turquoise, the color of a perfect summer sky, shot through with a fine, dark matrix like a map of the land itself. It was a piece of the West, honest and beautiful and built to last. He held it out to her on his open palm. He couldn't bring himself to kneel. It was not his way. He could only offer what he had, as he was. He finally found his voice, the words rough and hesitant. "I'm clumsy at this. Eva." It was the first time he had used her name, and it felt both strange and right on his tongue. "I don't know the right words. All I know is that for 5 years, my world has been silent and gray. And then you came, and there was light." He paused, struggling. "I want to learn how to live in it. I want to learn for a lifetime, if you'll let me." Ava looked from the ring in his palm to the raw hope in his eyes. A slow, beautiful smile spread across her face, a smile that held no weariness, only a deep, quiet strength. She did not immediately reach for the ring. "We'll have conditions. Mr. Maddox," she said, her tone gentle but firm. He blinked, surprised. "Conditions?" "Yes," she said, Her smile widened. "We will be partners, not a shadow of the other, not a warden for the other's grief. I will keep my shop. My name will be on the sign. My work is who I am." "I would not ask you to change," he said, his voice husky. "And you will keep your ranch." She continued, her gaze unwavering. "Your horses, your craft with leather, that is who you are. We will stand beside each other, not in front of each other. We will keep our respect for ourselves and for the other. That is the only foundation that will last out here." She was not asking for promises of love and devotion in the way of songs and poems. She was forging a contract, a partnership based on the hard, practical realities of the life they had both chosen. She was offering him a future built not on forgetting his past, but on honoring the man it had made him, and on respecting the woman she had become. A profound sense of relief washed over Cole, so powerful it almost brought him to his knees. She understood. She saw it all, and she was not trying to fix him. She was offering to stand with him, whole and complete in herself. He nodded, a slow, sure movement. "Agreed," he said. A small, real smile touched his own lips. "And you," he added, his voice finding its strength, "will remind me to smile whenever you see the walls starting to go back up." Her smile was radiant. "That is a condition I will be honored to uphold." She looked down at the turquoise ring, then held out her left hand, the one with the freshly bandaged wrist. "Agreed," she said softly, with a hand that was surprisingly steady. Cole picked up the ring and slid it onto her finger. It fit perfectly. The brilliant blue of the stone against her skin was a startling, beautiful splash of color, a promise of sky and water in a parched land. The silver caught the morning sun, and for a moment, it seemed to hold all the light in the world. He stood then, and she rose to meet him. He hesitated for a fraction of a second before his arms went around her, pulling her gently against him. It was not a desperate, passionate embrace, but one of quiet, profound homecoming. She rested her head against his chest, her good arm wrapping around his waist. She could feel the steady, strong beat of his heart under her ear. They stood like that for a long time, two solitary people who had found in each other a refuge from the storm. The only sound was the rustle of the wind as it stirred the dry leaves of the yucca plants along the street. A soft, whispering sound like a distant promise. In the west, the pale, washed-out sky was beginning to bruise with color. A bank of heavy, gray clouds, the color of wet slate, was massing on the horizon. Pregnant with the first real storm of the summer, the air grew thick, the stillness before a deluge. The small wooden bridge that crossed the arroyo on the trail to the dry arrow, its timbers already old and weathered, looked fragile and inadequate against the coming flood. The storm broke the day before their wedding. It was not a violent, dusty gale like the one that had thrown them together, but a true summer deluge, a sky-opening flood that turned the dry arroyos into churning brown rivers and the dusty streets of Arroyo Mesa into a sea of mud. It rained all night, a steady, relentless drumming on the roof of Ava's shop, and when dawn came, the world was awash. The wooden bridge on the trail to the dry arrow was gone, not damaged, but utterly erased, its timbers swept away by the torrent that had been, only a day before, a dry creek bed. The small adobe church in town, their intended venue, had a leaking roof and was filled with half a dozen families whose own homes had been flooded. The wedding, it seemed, was impossible. Cole and Eva stood on the porch of her shop, looking out at the muddy, waterlogged street. He didn't look defeated, merely thoughtful. She didn't look disappointed, only determined. It was Miguel Ortega who provided the solution. He had ridden into town by a long, treacherous upland route, his poncho dripping, his horse splattered with mud to its belly. He stood before them, water running from the brim of his hat, and made his pronouncement with a simple, unadorned dignity. "The Dry Arrow barn," he said. "It is new. It is strong. The roof does not leak. It is the cleanest barn in this county." He looked from Cole to Ava, It is a good place, a strong place, to start a life. And so it was decided. The people of Arroyo Mesa, weary from the storm but hungry for a celebration, turned the problem into a project. Henderson brought bolts of clean burlap from his mercantile, which the women spread over the packed earth floor of the barn. The paper lanterns from the Founders' Day festival, which had been salvaged and dried, were rehung from the high rafters, casting a soft, warm, multicolored glow. The air, usually thick with the scent of hay and horses, was now filled with the fragrance of pine boughs cut from the high country and the sweet, spicy aroma of pies and cakes baked in the town's kitchens. Ava, in a simple cream-colored dress, provided the final, transformative touch. She unpacked the heavy, painted backdrop from her studio, the one with the serene, cloudy sky, and with Miguel's help, hung it against the far wall. The mundane interior of a working barn, a place of wood and tools and earth, was suddenly anchored by a patch of heaven. It became an altar. It became a sanctuary. The circuit preacher, a thin, kind-faced man who had been stranded in town by the flood, performed the service. His words were not a grand sermon, but a quiet prayer, as simple and sturdy as the people gathered before him. When it was time for the vows, a profound silence fell over the barn, broken only by the gentle sound of rain still dripping from the eaves. Cole turned to Eva. He looked not at the preacher, but directly into her eyes. His voice, when he spoke, was clear and steady, a low rumble that resonated in the quiet space. "I will laugh," he said, "and I will listen." It was a promise to tear down the last of his walls, to open the final, locked rooms of his heart. Ava's gaze never wavered. Her voice was just as clear, a soft counterpoint to his deep tones. "I will photograph," she said, a promise to remain herself, to never lose the core of her own identity. "And I will believe." It was a promise to trust, to have faith not in a perfect future, but in the resilient, imperfect man who stood before her. The fiddler from the festival, his instrument now dry, began to play. It was the same waltz they had danced to before, but this time the music was softer, more intimate. Cole took Ava's hand, his other hand finding the small of her back, and they danced their second dance. There was no clumsiness now. There was no hesitation. Their steps were sure, their movements fluid. A single, graceful orbit in the warm lantern light. They moved as if they had been dancing together their entire lives. When the music ended, Ava went to her camera, which she had set up on its tripod in a corner of the barn. The townspeople watched, a little confused, as the bride began to fuss with her own photographic equipment. She adjusted the lens, checked the focus, and slid a fresh glass plate into the holder. Then she set the small clockwork timer on the shutter. She walked back to Cole's side, her movements unhurried. She slipped her hand into his just as the timer began its soft, mechanical whirring. He looked down at her, a question in his eyes. She just smiled. He looked at her, and the whole, vast, guarded landscape of his face softened. The last 5 years of pain, of solitude, of grief, fell away like a mask, and for a single, incandescent moment, all that was left was a raw, wondering adoration. He looked at her as if she were the first sunrise he had ever seen. The timer clicked, the shutter opened and closed, and the moment was captured forever. Later that evening, after the last of the guests had made their careful way back to town, after the pies were eaten and the cider was drunk, the rain finally stopped. A profound, clean-smelling quiet settled over the dry Arrow. Cole and Eva sat on the porch of the main house, the house that was now their home. They sat side by side on the top step, her head resting on his shoulder, his arm around her, their hands intertwined. The night air was cool and damp, and the sound of the water receding from the flooded pasture was a gentle, sighing murmur. For a long time, they said nothing, content in the shared, peaceful silence. Then Ava spoke, her voice a soft whisper in the darkness. "I want to start a school," she said, "in the afternoons, for the children on the outlying ranches, the ranch hand's children. I could teach them their letters, reading and sums. She paused, then added, and I could teach them how to see, how to take pictures. Cole was silent for a moment. The old Cole, the man of stone, might have seen this as a complication, an intrusion into the quiet life he had so carefully constructed. But that man was gone. He turned his head and kissed the top of her hair. A slow smile spread across his face, a smile she could feel more than see in the darkness. The Dry Arrow has an empty room, he said, and in that simple, unquestioning acceptance of her dream, in the easy way he made it their own, she felt the last of the stones of his prison fall. They did not fall with a crash or with a roar of thunder. They simply dissolved, stone by stone, with a quiet, sure finality, leaving in their place an open field, ready for a new planting. The next morning dawned bright and clear. The sky was scrubbed clean, the air sharp and new. Cole and Eva were not resting. They were down at the washed-out crossing, their sleeves rolled up, their boots already muddy. He was assessing the damage, his practical mind already designing a new, stronger bridge. She was beside him, helping to clear the debris carried down by the flood. They were not alone for long. First, Miguel arrived with the ranch hands. Then came Henderson in his wagon, bringing lumber and tools. Soon, others from town appeared, men and women, the same people who had celebrated in their barn the night before. They came with saws and hammers, with ropes and food, with a quiet, unspoken understanding. McCready had tried to tear their community apart over water. Now, water had brought them together. They were building more than a bridge. They were building a new kind of family, one forged in shared adversity and cemented by mutual aid. By late afternoon, the new bridge was taking shape, its sturdy timbers spanning the now docile arroyo. Cole was on the far bank, directing the placement of a heavy support beam. He looked up, across the half-finished structure, and saw Eva on the other side, handing a tool to one of the Henderson boys. The sun caught her hair, turning it to a halo of fire. He straightened up, a wide, easy grin spreading across his face. He cupped his hands around his mouth and called out to her, his voice ringing with a joy that was new and clear and strong. "Hey, Mrs. Maddox." She looked up, shielding her eyes against the sun, a question on her face. "Smile for me," he called, and she did. She looked across the bridge they were all building together, at the man her love had brought back into the light, and she gave him a smile that was so full of life and promise it could have powered the sun. And as he watched her, he saw that brilliant, beautiful smile reflected in his own eyes, breaking the very last of his defenses, and leaving nothing but an open heart. Thank you for listening to our story. We'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from, so please leave a comment below to share your thoughts and connect with our community. If you enjoyed this journey into the Old West, please subscribe to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850, and give this video a like. And if you'd like to help this story reach more listeners, please consider hitting the hype button to show your support.